So let's just jump on in. So show of hands, who here would like to unlock more vitality for their life? Okay, lovely. Who here doesn't really know what I'm referring to when I say vitality? Is there any confusion around that term? Is it a bit wishy-washy? If you have anything that comes to mind when I say the word vitality, a word or two, throw it in the chat. I want to see where you guys are at, what this actually brings up in you, that term. Let's get that out of the way there. Because it can mean many different things to many different people. And if we don't define terms, then it's setting us up for potential confusion. Let's see. Where's the chat? Let me put that chat over there. Energy, unlimited energy, erect lingam, straight to the heart of it. Energy, life force, connection to our source. Lovely, lovely, lovely. Yep, energy. Yeah, so I feel like we're mostly on the same page. For me, vitality is that. It's when we are filled with life force. We have the energy that we need to do the things that we need to do or want to do. We have the fuel to pursue our dreams and to grow and to learn and to expand and or to physically recover and regenerate, right? And mentally, right? All these things are connected. And so it's that vital life force. It's like raw power, raw potential power that comes to us through many different sources. Obviously, my focus, well, not obviously, you'll see here that my focus in many ways is through physical and nutritional means, but there's many ways we can tap into these things. We got to taste a little bit with that little breathing exercise at the beginning there. So there's many ways to cultivate and to nourish vitality, but really, I want to help you connect the dots on how things like digestion and or digestive issues tie into hormones and energy and this end result, which is vitality, so that we can fix those issues, we can beat fatigue, we can have the energy we want to have, and ultimately we can thrive for life. I always say we don't do health, we don't do, whether it's fitness, nutrition, lifestyle, we don't do that stuff just for its own sake. We do it so because of what it allows us to do, right? It allows us to be more and to do more and to experience more and to give more and create more in this wonderful journey that we call life. So let's hop on in and start getting through. I'm not going to read through this. This is just the legal requirements, so I don't pretend like I'm being a doctor or some sort of official medical practitioner giving medical advice. That's not happening here. This is just personal experience, educational, informational, and yeah, always consult with your official medical provider before starting any new programs or dietary plans. Okay, enough of that. Thank you for joining, as I already said. And if you don't know who I am, that's totally okay. We'll cover my story in short soon here. But really, this talk is for you. This talk is to, again, help you connect the dots and provide you some knowledge, some tools, some potentially greater understanding that you can apply into your life, into how you see yourself as a man moving through the modern world and taking care of yourself and doing the things that, again, allow you to experience this thing we call vitality, which is really the foundation for everything. When we don't have that, as you may have experienced in the past, as certainly I have experienced in the past, when we don't have health, when we don't have energy, nothing else works. And it's the only thing that we care about at that point. And it becomes, for me, it becomes a life's mission. If you don't already have something to take notes on and you like to take notes, this is a little reminder. Writing by hand always makes it, not always, in my experience, handwriting sinks deeper into the brain. It uses more of the neurology to retain information better. But of course, you can type or put in notes in an app or something like that. And I am recording this and we'll be able to share that recording. So don't feel like you need to scribble furiously. But if you want to capture things, definitely do. And like I said, although I will attempt, my intention is to cover a lot, cover some big picture items. It is just that, this is a big picture presentation. And so I won't be able to go into the minute, super personalized details. Some of that may be during the questions and answers. And I will, for anyone who wants to dive deeper, I can let you know how to do that and to book a free call after this to dive deeper on your personal situation and get some insight on that. So don't worry about getting all your questions answered right here and now. What I want you to take away from this talk, number one, how digestion is central. And I mean that in the broadest sense. If digestion is impaired, it's impacted, it's not functioning properly, nothing else is going to work to the degree that it is capable of working. And that's true both for how we digest food, which is the main focus, but also how we digest experiences mentally and emotionally, right? And energetically. If we can't take in and metabolize the inputs and information, which food is ultimately just information in a densified form that nourishes our body. If we can't take those things in, we're going to end up with stagnation and blockages and issues developing from there. Number two is how the gut and immune system and energy are all linked together, and as such must be addressed in tandem, right? This is the basis of any holistic thinking or holistic healing or holistic life improvement, right? It's not taking separate pieces of the puzzle, but it's looking at the bigger picture and finding synergy and harmony among these different pieces. And another key is to understand why normal on a blood test does not equal good or healthy or optimal by any means, and what a normal range is actually derived from, which most people are rather surprised to hear if they've not been educated on that topic specifically. And those are our main three things. And we'll have, things along the way that will trickle into that, little nuggets here and there, of course, but these are the three major pieces that I want to address, at least start the conversation on in this talk. And by all means, if people, if you guys enjoy this, I'm happy to do these things regularly and plan to for 2025 to have consistent, monthly or so open forums like this to dive into specific topics that directly allow us as men to live with more energy and abundance and clarity and performance in all ways, all the ways that matter most. So as you think about what's going to be the most useful insights you're looking to gather, information you're seeking, things you can apply to your own life, I want you to think about these sort of descriptors as to who this talk is for, right? This talk in some ways started being developed for the past version of me who didn't know any of this stuff and was just desperate to feel better. And so this talk is for you. You may see yourself in some of these, and I hope that you do, and you can connect that, because having a why for you as to why you want to learn and improve and retain makes that process more successful. So this talk is for you if you consider yourself a driven professional, or maybe you're an entrepreneur like myself. I'm sure there's a few of us in here, a father, son, brother, awakening man, or seeker of truth who wants to expand, who wants to improve your health, energy, and feel better in your body on a consistent basis. This talk is for you if you find yourself waking up feeling unrested, no matter how much sleep you're getting, or dealing with things like brain fog or an inability to focus during the day. Talk is for you if you've been experiencing digestive issues for some time. Maybe that's indigestion, heartburn, bloating, nausea, diarrhea, cramps, constipation, you name it. This talk is also for you if you've been given a diagnosis, maybe like I was, of IBS, anxiety, depression, burnout, adrenal fatigue, whatever it might be, whatever label you've been slapped with by the system, and that you're not willing to settle for that label and or to settle for what the in the box, prescriptive treatments for that might be. This is definitely for you. If you haven't felt like your best in some time because of health challenges, and again, the medical system or your doctor has been of little to no help practically for you in your search. Or maybe you just feel worried that if you and your health, your energy aren't able to keep up, that's going to affect your business, your family, your personal life, your dreams, your hopes, your projects, that those things will be dragged down and will suffer, and you'll be unable to show up for those that you care about most, to show up for yourself in a way that feels good and feels empowered. And lastly, if you feel decently good, right? If every day you're not in a crisis point, but you're like, I feel okay, I can get through the day, right? You're feeling decent, you're feeling good, and you know that there's so much more potential to tap into, right? To get closer to what I would describe as peak or an optimal state of functioning, which for many of us, in my experience, we haven't truly glimpsed because we've become so accustomed to our baseline. It's one of the most amazing things about humans is how good we are at normalizing a particular state, whether that's a good state or that's a very broken down and exhausted state. We become used to it and it becomes our normal day to day. The way I see things, many of us are running on empty. Many of us are sacrificing our health for short-term, whether it's work commitments or it's family commitments, or it's this sense of just trying to keep up. And I share this picture because it exemplifies a lot of the things that are very easy and convenient to fall into. And yet, if they go unchecked, they can lead to issues in the longer term, right? This is not to hate on baked goods in particular, or coffee or tea, whatever he's having, but it's this pattern of convenience, of stimulation, of overly processed nutrition, and of being hooked to a screen, right? To being pulled forward, rounded forward, leaning forward. All these things, if we don't have countermeasures to balance them out, will break down our system, right? They will lead to energy peaks and crashes, typically, and this feeling of like, I just can't get enough. I just can't maintain my energy. The whole afternoon slump, which is all too common. And I won't go into with any depth today, although I do love the body and posture and movement. But staying stagnant in these kinds of postures is very degenerative to the system. And so it leads us into a reactive approach, right? Where we're just keeping up, but we're not getting ahead of the game. And so if something happens, we get caught off guard, or we get, beaten down, we get thrown off. We have to kind of scramble to keep it together. We don't have extra capacity in the tank, or we don't have protocols or practices that we can rely upon when we feel like we're getting to that point of, okay, I got to take a break here. I got to unplug. I got to slow down. If we don't have those things, we end up with this pattern of lost productivity, lower energy, poor mental function or worsening mental function, just a lack of clarity, a lack of sharpness, mood even can get diminished, and stubborn symptoms that are a pain in the rear, as well as lost or diminished in terms of quality time with the people and places and pastimes or projects that we really love. And it creates the kind of life that is representative of a fraction of what we're here for, what our potential is as driven and awakening men. You'll notice I don't use the term awakened because it's all in a spectrum, right? I don't think while we're still in this physical body, we are ever truly awakened in a permanent sense. But either way, I'm a nerd for words. I hope that some of you are too. Just want to throw that in there. At the same time, again, we have this situation where the so-called healthcare system has very few options that are worthwhile or actually get to the root of solving any of our concerns. And this could sound awful, but for me, it inspires hope. And it inspires hope because we are in a time and have been in a time for quite a while now. I would say once the internet really got pushed into mainstream adoption and information sharing was at the tips of our fingers, where we have access to so much more than we've ever had in terms of information, tools, practical understanding, and options for navigating what we decide to do with our bodies and how we decide to care for our bodies. And yes, I love it. Word, amen, exactly. Drop a 2 in the chat if you are optimistic about where we're headed, the time that we're in, the options we have access to. Drop a 2 in the chat if you feel good about that. And a sip of water. You got some 2s. I'm super optimistic. And I don't know if it's just because I'm a double Sagittarius. I don't think so. It's kind of in my nature to be very optimistic and always seeing the silver lining. But there's just so much good going on and so much potential in our hands. And so now we come to the question. This is the question that's been driving me, propelling me forward on this quest of health and better functioning for 14 years now. And that question is, what is required for true holistic health and vitality in the modern world? We can get more specific and apply that to us as men. What is required for you, for me, to live as a vital, healthy, resilient man in the modern world? That is a question which occurred to me when I was at a very low point and has driven me ever since, and continues to expand and unlock new areas of study and understanding. And so from that, the next question became for me, okay, how can I make those things more digestible? Pun intended, right? Literally, physically digestible and mentally, emotionally digestible. How can I make these things that might be overwhelming or complex easier to understand and to assimilate? And with that, make them more accessible, right? Information sharing, access to different options, access to different, whatever it is, protocols, products, supplements, programs, whatever it might be, make that more accessible to more people. Because clearly, I wasn't the only one struggling with my health. And then, one of my personal favorites, because I am a foodie and a nutritionist after all, it's got to be delicious. It's got to be savory. It's got to be enjoyable, right? And the bigger picture for this, what is required, this recipe that we're building, not only does it have to be digestible and accessible and delicious, but it's got to be fun. It's got to be something that you enjoy. If you're going to do anything for a prolonged period of time to make it sustainable, it's got to be enjoyable. Otherwise, at least for me, and to a degree, I mean, I don't mean you're going to be blissfully blasted off into ecstatic bliss every time you make your morning smoothie, but that the process of putting together some quality nutrients and taking that in and tasting it and savoring it, there is a certain level of sensory enjoyment that can be derived and tapped into. So the question some of you may still have, who am I and how did I get here? Why am I here? Why do I care about these things? Why do I have lasers shining into my neck in this picture? And how did I come to be this character, this kind of eccentric journeyman of natural health and men's vitality? Well, it started many, many years ago. I'll get to that in a second, but more so the who am I? So my name is Brian Hardy, Brian David Hardy, which I might start going by that. I mean, David feels like a powerful middle name to put out there. Anyways, Brian Hardy, holistic nutritionist and lifestyle coach, and really men's health coach for the last 4 or 5 years now. That's been my primary focus, is specifically working with men, with the brothers. A biohacking entrepreneur, someone who's been exposed to a whole lot in the realm of health and wellness and biohacking and this and that, and the merging of that with business in different communities and different events and so forth. An amateur cook and forager. I mean, I could have put professional cook because I've been paid to cook, but I don't consider myself a chef or a professional in that sense. Still more of an amateur. And forager. I like to get out there, pick mushrooms, pick fresh greens and herbs and things. I know my way around a forest pretty decently for what's medicinal and edible. And with that, a voracious learner and an adventure seeker. Again, this could be my Sagittarius coming out, but I just love a good adventure. And I imagine many of you do too. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be here and be connected to Rawa and all the great things that he's been doing and animating through this community. Now, this picture, if I had to share one picture as what was my genesis point, it would be this. It would be appendicitis. So 2010, I'm 18 years old. I'm in my first year of university. I get really sick. I'm sick for about a week. I feel just weird. I feel off. I don't know what's going on. It's like a flu, but not a flu. I got this weird feeling in my stomach, but I can't pinpoint it. So I'm just basically living on Gatorade and episodes of Breaking Bad, or Dexter. Dexter was the show at the time, and just trying to get through this. And it was rough. I was having cold sweats. I was barely sleeping, couldn't eat anything, couldn't take a shit, which now I know is a pretty big red flag for appendicitis. But either way, I didn't know. So I'm suffering my way through this illness for the better part of a week. And then, to make a very long story, potentially long story, short, Pedro, your dating profile like that. To make a long story short, I went to a hospital. The pain became so intense that I was like, something is seriously wrong. I go to the hospital. They totally misdiagnosed me. They completely missed that I have appendicitis. They give me 2 shots of morphine, some Tylenol 3s, and do an X-ray, and then send me home and tell me I have the flu and I might miss a few days of school. Luckily, I didn't listen to that. I called my mom, who was about an hour and a half away. She drives down, picks me up. We go and fill the prescription, stupidly enough, and then go to another hospital where they do a CT scan and they tell me, you're a mess. We need to operate immediately. You may have a perforated colon. Hopefully, it's just your appendix, but we need to get in there immediately because it looks bad. Luckily, they go in, they do their thing. They saved my life, right? And I'm forever grateful to modern emergency medicine for that fact. They clean me up. They sew me up. Surgeon tells me afterwards, that was the worst abdomen I've ever seen, and you were probably hours away from going into septic shock. So it was bad. It was not good. It was not your typical, tiny little incision, get in there, pull the appendix out, sew it up, and you're, back to normal in a few days. And what it did was it started a chain of events, a chain of recovery. And yeah, to answer the question, the hospital made a big error because it should be very easy to identify appendicitis in those conditions. But it started this chain of events because not much about the recovery process was straightforward. And so I'm on multiple rounds of antibiotics for like months to get, the infection dealt with. I went into the hospital about 170 pounds. I came out 11 days later at about 145 pounds. And I couldn't stand upright because they had to open me up completely from, below the ribs to above or below the belly button. And so the abs had to be totally cut open and then sewed back together. So I was sutured in a hunched over position for quite a while. And it was the most humbling experience of my life and the most challenging experience of my life. And it showed me, first of all, you're going to die one day. So pay attention to what you're doing and how you're living. And this body is very fragile. And clearly things that you've been doing haven't been working because you would have been dead if it weren't for modern medicine. Because of a previous history of eating a lot of junk and having a very toxic, overloaded digestive system. And so, again, it was amazing that they were able to fix me and, allow me to keep living. This is a picture of me not too long after. This is an important picture because my mom on the left there was recovering from chemotherapy. I'm still at a very low point dealing with the side effects of surgery and scar tissue and candida overgrowth from the antibiotics and my digestive system just being wiped out. And it was around this time that I decided, okay, that's enough. I'm dedicating my life to the study and the pursuit of health and through natural and integrative means because this shit is crazy. And it shouldn't be so hard to be healthy, right? And it shouldn't be so hard to get good information from medical professionals because they didn't have any explanation as to why this happened, what I could do to prevent, complications in the future. There was very little that was given to me in that regard. And if you've been there, if you have had a similar experience or had that similar thought of, why does it feel so hard? Why can't it just be simpler? If that's been a thought that you've had either at one time or another, or perpetually, drop a 3 in the chat because I sense that that's a pretty common occurrence for a lot of us. And it really doesn't have to be that way. It shouldn't be that way. And it won't be that way in the future. That I know for sure. And so that is the short version of my catalyzing event, sort of the Wounded Healer initiation, and what brought me into doing this kind of work. And so my life during this period, this was a very still challenged period. My energy was in the shedder. My libido was non-existent. I could barely stay awake in class. Just couldn't tolerate most foods. Many, many things were not working. And perhaps you can relate to this, gas and bloating very, very frequently. never waking up energized, right? Having this kind of heaviness, this latent depression and or anxiety that fluctuates between these two kind of extremes of dysregulation. Worrying about food, right? What could I eat? What couldn't I eat? What planning the next meal, becoming quite obsessive in that regard in a very unhealthy way and feeling isolated because of it, right? I can remember going to class, again, this is 2010, 2011, with a 1 liter mason jar of freshly made green juice, which today is like the cool thing, right? That's like the cool, hip, healthy thing. Back then, there was no one drinking green juice in university lectures. It was just not a thing. It was your Tim Hortons and your donuts and your coffees and your this and that. And so I felt weird. I would hide my green juice on the floor underneath the table and just take sips, trying to be inconspicuous about it. But it was isolating. It was definitely isolating. I was also searching for this elusive magic cure, right? What's the silver bullet? What's the one thing? There's got to be one thing that I can do to unlock what's going on. Brain fog, memory issues, just this lack of clarity and sharpness that really made it hard to study and to be a productive student. I was in a totally different focus. I was in a full course load of engineering technology with a side diploma in mechanics and technology. And so it was a very busy time and a lot to study and remember, and it was not so easy to do so. And then also there's the blood sugar roller coaster. Up and down we go, multiple times a day, looking for that hit, trying to get something to sustain me and make me feel closer to what I remembered feeling like. And with that, this hopeless feeling and thinking, why couldn't it just go back to before this happened, right? Just go back to normal, back to the old way. Of course, those kinds of thoughts don't get us anywhere and they just perpetuate our suffering, but I was there for a time. And so although the medical system kept me alive, it couldn't make me well. And this was a big breakthrough. This was the taking on a full responsibility. Okay, no one got me into this except myself. No one can get me out of this but myself. No one can feed me. No one can make decisions for me. Certainly not this medical system that's bloated and inefficient and totally disconnected from the reality of health. And so we got to find something better. We got to find something different. And so the three big issues as they came, and again, I'm not going to go into these in extreme depth. We don't have the time for that. Scar tissue. And you'll see in a picture coming up, my scar is very non-ordinary. It's large, it's big, it connects to a lot of things beneath the surface. And so that leads to a kinking of the intestinal tubes, aka a bowel obstruction, also incredibly painful. Don't recommend it. But this started to occur about a year after the surgery because I didn't know. No one told me, hey, if you do these things proactively, you'll have way less scar tissue when this all heals up. I didn't get that memo. So I got the memo of, oh my God, I can't eat, I can't shit, I need to puke, my stomach is in a knot. What the hell's going on? Oh, bowel obstruction. Oh, turns out they're very common after my kind of surgery. Who knew? Who knew? After that, the biggest piece, this is why gut health became really my core focus and has been for my entire practice. Candida overgrowth and gut imbalances, gut inconsistency, IBS, IBD, whatever you want to call it. That's what I ended up with because massive amounts of antibiotics not followed up with any proactive protocols to regenerate and repopulate and recuperate is going to lead to an imbalance. And typically for most of us, that's going to lead to a candida yeast imbalance, which is not a fun thing and which is incredibly common just because of processed foods, sugars in the diet, and the wide use of antibiotics. Luckily nowadays, probiotics are more popular. A lot of people know about them, use them after antibiotics, but back then it was not such the case. And the third piece was this chronic stress, anxiety, and a persistently lower energy that surrounded these issues. And, I'm trying to balance whether it's study at one time, launching a business at another time, waking up at 4:30 to drive Uber in Toronto to pay for my new car at another time in the journey. And it was this pattern of just not resting enough, not taking enough care to have the yin side of things, the regenerate, the rest, the relax side of things. So it's this constant trying to go, go, go with not enough taking my foot off the gas to bounce back. Just to make a visual representation. So this is me. This is 2013, I think. So I'm still very much underweight, very restricted in my eating, very neurotic about eating, struggling to find something that makes sense, that provides a lasting solution for this gut issue that had been going on, all in all, about 4 years, from shortly after life-saving surgery to, okay, I feel like I'm at a stable baseline, and a lot of trial and error in between. And again, this low energy piece. And clearly I wasn't getting much sun back then because I look white as a ghost in that picture. To a more recent picture where ideal weight, feeling much better, taking better care of myself, very flexible with my eating, have found solutions and practices and protocols that really work. And energy is a much more consistent thing, so much so that I can get back to working out consistently because I love to train. And I'll often giggle because, if I'm wearing hoodies and, bulky clothing, people don't expect me to have a developed physique. And I'm like, no, no, no. I'm not just some, book nerd who just, sits behind the computer all the time. And that's really important to me. It's important that I live these things. If I'm going to share or teach or preach or, coach, I must live these things first. And I do love physical training, as I'm sure many of you do as well. Okay. Again, I'm going to revisit these things as we get into some of these keys and start to really kind of pull back the myths or the misunderstandings that some of us have around these issues. So digestion is central, main takeaway we're going to dive into. Again, the gut, immune system, and energy are all linked. And why normal on a blood test doesn't equal good or optimal. And I would be curious, if I had done a blood test when my appendix had ruptured, I'm not sure how much would have actually shown up. Maybe some liver enzymes, maybe some imbalances in electrolytes or nutrients because I'd been starving essentially. But it might have been healthy and normal, like so many people here when they do a blood test. And again, this is high level. So the first key that I want to dive into here and leave you guys with a clear understanding of is this idea of leaky gut. Drop a 4 in the chat if you've heard the term leaky gut, if you've sensed that applies to you in some capacity, if you've gone down the Google rabbit train or rabbit trail of what is leaky gut, how to fix leaky gut. Yeah, so some people heard of it. Yep. Incredibly common. We're all going to experience some degree of it at some point. And let's get into what it really is and why it impacts everything else. So this is a diagram, fairly simplified diagram, right? If we were to see on a microscopic level what's happening, it's probably a whole lot more busy than this, but visuals are useful for illustrating the concept. So leaky gut, the technical term for that in the scientific literature is intestinal permeability. This is why a lot of doctors say leaky gut doesn't exist. It's like, well, yeah, leaky gut is a layman's term that we use to describe something that a lot of people are experiencing. But intestinal permeability certainly exists and has been well studied for a long time. And so it's when the connections, these things, tight junctions that hold the cells of the lining of the intestines together to provide protection from the pathogens, the irritants, the toxins, whatever it is that we don't want to absorb. When those things get damaged due to some inflammatory injury, it opens up this space. And we're talking microscopic spaces, right? Very, very, very small spaces in most cases. It's not like you could look into your stomach and see a gap or see blood oozing out of your intestines. It's not usually that dramatic of a thing. But on the microscopic level, we have undigested food, we have viruses, we have bacteria getting into circulation through the digestive tract in a place where they do not belong. The immune system is not ready, is not trained to allow those things to come through without a fight. And so what happens, these things get through because of whatever it is. You could give yourself a transient, a temporary leaky gut simply by going and running a couple, a couple hours in the hot sun on a summer's day. You can give yourself a temporary case of this. It's very common. It happens all the time to endurance athletes. Chemical exposures, certain foods, if you have a sensitivity or an allergy, or if that food is contaminated with some kind of toxin. Many people have heard of glyphosate. It's sprayed on a lot of grains and a lot of gluten-containing products, a lot of processed foods. That stuff can cause a leaky gut directly. And so this triggers the immune system to go, wait a minute, something's going on. This is like an emergency on an immune level. We have to tag these intruders and get rid of them. We got to take these things and get them out of the body. And so that brings this whole cascade of immune response. It's a lot of stress on a cellular level. It's why the people experiencing this tend to have very low energy, very poor mental function. They're constantly in this depleted state, and their immune system is constantly being challenged. So they tend to catch more colds or catch more flus or viruses, etc., because they're in this ongoing weakened state. And this is also one of the keys for any autoimmune condition. And I won't dive too deeply into that right now, but for an autoimmune condition to manifest, in most cases, there's going to be a degree of leaky gut or intestinal permeability that acts as a trigger. And depending on what's getting in while your stomach is compromised, while your intestines rather are compromised, that can determine what sort of an autoimmune response one might have. Again, bigger topic for another time, but just to highlight that, because autoimmunity is also on the rise, has been for some time, and is incredibly common. Essentially, you feel like crap. If this is going on and it's at a severe degree, you're not going to feel great. You're not going to be absorbing the nutrients you're taking in. You're not going to be eliminating toxins effectively, and your system's going to be in this constant battle, this constant state of inflammation, trying to manage the situation. All of this can feel, if you haven't had a direct experience, it can feel a little bit, abstract. It can feel a little bit just out there. So let's take a real life example. All right, let's bring this down so you can see how this might fit into a practical real life story. Now, before we do that, the key here, if you aren't absorbing and assimilating the nutrients you're consuming, then you, by definition, you won't have a true baseline of health, right? What you think of as your baseline will be a diminished baseline because your system doesn't have the raw materials that it needs to actually function. Digestion, just as a side note, is a lot more than just eating food and, pooping, right? Digestion is a multi-step process. And if there's an issue at any particular part of the process, it can throw off the entire thing. And so digestion is much more than just eating food. It's mastication, chewing, chew, chew, chew. Step number one, if you don't chew your food, and if you don't chew it thoroughly, which, side note, if all you did coming out of this presentation was chew your food until it's like a paste, make baby food in your mouth before you swallow, you'd be doing yourself so many favors for maximizing what you're getting from your food and minimizing the potential for fermentation and gas and issues further down the line. Neutralization, stomach acid, that's a defense mechanism, essentially. It also helps to pre-digest proteins and break things down, but stomach acid is there to neutralize pathogens, right? Parasites, bacteria, fungus, viruses, whatever we might be exposed to that's on the food we're consuming. We need to have a very strong acidic gut to deal with those things, right? And many people don't, right? Chronic stress will deplete stomach acid. Dehydration will deplete stomach acid and lead to, in many cases, funnily enough, acid reflux, which many times is a lack of stomach acid. But again, it's a whole other topic for another time. Absorption comes after that. So once we've broken things down, we've chewed them, the stomach has neutralized them and started breaking that stuff down, it gets into the intestines and we can actually absorb these things through that gut lining that you saw earlier. From there, we assimilate. So it gets into circulation and then to be assimilated on a cellular level, right? Those nutrients have places they need to get to. They need to get to your liver. They need to get to your muscle. They need to get to your brain. The cells of those tissues must be able to assimilate those nutrients in order to function. And then the last piece is elimination, right? It's the kidneys, it's the pee, it's the poo, it's the colon. It's getting that stuff out, which is toxic, which is waste, which needs to be eliminated so that our system can continue to function and continue to generate energy and do the things that it's designed to do. I mentioned a real life example, so I want to go through this. So this is my man, JP. When I met him, he was 31 years old. He was married. He was running a custom printing and design company, and he was also teaching. So a very full-on life, a lot of responsibility, a lot on his plate. He was diagnosed with something called ankylosing spondylitis, which is a very kind of complex term for autoimmune fusion of the spinal vertebrae. It's very, very painful, very, very debilitating if it's not treated properly. And, oh, I just saw Zolt fell out of the room. There we go. Get him back in there. Hopefully he wasn't out there for too long. Sorry about that, Zolt. Okay. He's got a lot going on. He's diagnosed with this quite potentially crippling, physically crippling condition. Most people who have this that don't treat it integratively will end up being very, very locked up and fused in their spine and very limited and very in pain for the majority of their existence. Luckily, he was open. He was searching for alternatives, complementary things, and he was referred to me shortly after this diagnosis. And so he was a workaholic, essentially, and he would stay up until 12:30, 2:30 in the morning, sleep for, say, 6 to 9 hours, wake up, not rested, not feeling alert, dealing with some anxiety, dealing with what was essentially a 50-50 toss-up. Am I going to have energy and a positive mood to want to get through the day today? I'm not sure. It's a gamble. It's kind of a toss-up. That was where he was at. And he had tried things like changing his diet, trying to make little tweaks, but nothing was really sticking for him. He constantly had the low energy slumps in the day, addicted to sugar, caffeine, right? Those things, those quick hits. But he was overworked. He was overworked. He was undernourished. He was fluctuating between diarrhea and constipation, back and forth, back and forth. And, of course, he had this diagnosis, which was for him the, like big wake up aha moment of like, okay, this is serious. Let's figure out what's going on. Let's do something about it. And that's when we connected. And so what we did, big picture, to address all this, just a quick guess, and you can throw it in the chat. Where do you think we began? Where do you think I wanted to start with him? What did we address first? What do you think was the first thing we had to address for JP here to start to stabilize him and move him into a better direction? Any guesses? Any guesses? Diet. Maddie says diet. I'll say that's partly the answer. Stress, partly the answer. Sleep, partly the answer. Exercise, somewhat, although he needed to kind of chill for a while. Probiotics, somewhat, not exactly. I'll just give it to you. So it was basically rebuilding the gut. Attitude, that's a good one too. That's like, that could be, the correct answer if we flip it into what truly had to take place first, which was a shift in his mind, right? He had to decide, I'm going to get better. Of course, that's good. But we had to address his gut. We had to address this inflamed, again, this leaky gut scenario. He had all the symptoms of candida overgrowth, which I was acutely familiar with. And so we had to address that situation first. I wasn't going to get him exercising more. I wasn't going to get him, necessarily like meditating for an hour a day to reduce stress until we stopped the damage in his intestines, in his gut, and started to reverse out of that, started to stabilize him and allow him to actually absorb what he was taking in, actually produce energy from the food he was consuming. And so we cleaned up the diet. Yes, of course. Anti-inflammatory was the focus, right? He's already chronically inflamed. We have to reverse that. We have to quell the fire. We developed, someone said probiotics, so that's a supplement. We developed a personalized supplementation plan to support him through this. We did improve sleep and stress management. Those came in tandem and progressed through, the whole thing underlying this was targeting a multi-step gut cleanse and reset. A point on that is that he was eating a lot of quote unquote healthy foods, right? He was doing a lot of quote unquote healthy things, but he didn't know that, okay, I'm eating this thing that is otherwise healthy, but it's actually feeding this imbalance that I have, right? So this is where we have to be very contextual with our thinking and not be one size fits all blanket statements that this is good for everyone at every time. We've got to be more nuanced when it comes to nutrition. So removing those foods and then building them up from there. And so going through a multi-step process like this, he did it with his wife. They did it together. If you have a partner, a wife, a friend, a roommate, it's always easier to do these things together. If you don't, then having an experienced practitioner and ideally some community support, right? Again, is going to make it so much easier to get through something like this. It can be a real game changer. And so the big lesson coming out of that was that, or the lesson for you and I, is that the same things that work when someone is in a crisis point, when someone has a full-blown disease condition, those same principles apply to you and I when we're feeling just a little bit shitty, or just a little bit under the weather, or a little bit burnt out, or a little bit bloated. The same principles apply. It's just the severity is the difference, but the mechanisms are the same. And so if it works in an extreme case, we can be quite certain that it's going to support us and it's going to work to prevent us from ever getting to that extreme, but help us go from good to great. And I mean, one of the things that he had to say was that he had attempted to overhaul his diet, but he was trading one bad thing for another, right? Eating what he described as mountains of sugar and cheese, and then stopping when we got started. And I love this. I just have to share this, that during that time, I felt better in my body than I ever had in the last 10 years. This was like music to my ears. I'm like, yes, JP, yes, brother. Because he did the work, right? He did the things that needed to happen to move him from really, really terrible place to better than I have in 10 years. And that whole process was like a 12 to 14 week process. It wasn't like 6 months, right? So this stuff can work quickly if we know what we're doing and we have the right approach. And so, as he said, it gave him the confidence to overcome that devastating diagnosis, and that he was living proof that what you put into your body reflects how you feel, how you function. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just because I want to retain a good amount of time for questions. And I think that some of this next part might be redundant. Just to check in, are we good? Are we enjoying this? Are we learning things? Drop like a 5 in the chat or a thumbs up or something. Are we still engaged? Yes. Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up. If energy is waning, if anything is okay, 100%. Amazing. Thank you for the feedback. Sometimes it feels like I'm just talking to a screen, even though I can see some of your faces. So I'm glad to know this is hitting the mark. Okay, jumping ahead. Key number 2, these things, energy, mood, digestive function, they're all related. They can't be separated, even though we live in a society built on reductionism, built on what can we strip away? How can we break down the system? How can we break out all the parts and then manipulate specific parts to provide a specific function to then, patent a drug or a procedure and then sell that and profit and so forth is how modern medicine works. Versus holism, which is what we're talking about, right? Holism, whole being. It's a much bigger picture. Symptoms, right? Versus treating the root. Short term versus long term, big picture. And there's no shortage of, a pill for every ill, as they say in our society. And it's really refreshing to see just how many of us are very done with that approach, right? That whole thing is dying. It's already on its like gasping last breaths. Many systems and institutions are in that state, which is really exciting. But it's just great to see that More and more of us are in that place. And it's just really exciting to step deeply into this future of root causes, holistic, long-term focus, big picture focus. And so I'll just breeze over these. So these were two examples, two kind of slaps in the face for myself when I was recovering from the life-saving ruptured appendix surgery. So the two things they told me after to support my recovery: one, eat enough protein. No qualifier on the kind of protein and how to prepare it, how much to eat, how much is enough. Nothing like that. No mention of quality whatsoever. So eat enough protein, which, I mean, it's better than not eating enough protein, but still, it's a pretty piss poor recommendation for somebody who's just had their entire digestive system ripped apart and chemically sterilized, if you ask me. And then the second piece, which was really funny, was to use this stuff called bio oil to improve the appearance of the scar. Nothing to do with the adhesions and the really serious issues happening beneath the surface, but to improve the appearance of your scar, try this stuff called bio oil. Well, I tried this stuff called bio oil, and within 2 weeks, I had a mole growing on my scar. And I'm like, well, that seems strange. That was very quick. I didn't have a mole. I started applying this stuff. Now I have a mole. Is this precancerous? Is this why is this there? I stopped using this stuff. I looked it up. The first ingredient's mineral oil. They have a few nice, lavender, rosemary sprinkled in there, but a lot of crap that if you go on to another great resource, if you're not familiar, Skin Deep. This is the EWG cosmetic database. You can look this thing up. You can put in pretty much any product that you'll buy, a personal care product. It'll give you a score out of 10. 10 is the worst. Bio oil was a 7 with a moderate cancer risk and a high potential risk for allergies, immunotoxicity, and developmental and reproductive toxicity. So that's what I've been smearing on my fresh scar at the, recommendation of the doctors and nurses. Not the happiest day for me, but again, it just further showed me, okay, you can't count on these people to give you good information. How energy and digestion and hormones are linked is because what we consume, not only does it build your physical tissues, right? Not only are you made of the things you've consumed, but the hormones, the neurotransmitters, all of the things that facilitate you being alive and well are dependent on raw materials, raw building blocks that come from nutrients. And so to produce energy, you have to be able to break down that stuff through food and turn it into something usable, what we call ATP or cellular energy. It goes from, piece of steak or bowl of blueberries into cellular energy. And there's a lot of steps, from the start to the finish that we require to function. Same thing, neurotransmitters and hormones, which are kind of the same thing. We separate them to, make it easier to classify things, but they're pretty much the same thing. They're signaling molecules. They're very potent molecules. You're probably familiar with the term neurotransmitter, of course, hormones. These are pretty common terms. But just to show an example as to how this works. So don't get overwhelmed by the technical biochemistry here. Just look up here, phenylalanine. Phenylalanine, this is an essential amino acid, meaning you must consume it if your body is going to have it. So we get this through food, through many different foods. It's very common. It's in a lot of things. We get phenylalanine, and then our body, in its magic, turns that into tyrosine, which you can also get through food. You can also take through supplements. Then it turns it into dopa. Usually that's classified as L-dopa, which is the precursor to dopamine, right? This is the thing everyone talks about. I'm losing dopamine. I need a dopamine fast. If you have Parkinson's, they say you don't have enough dopamine, right? If you can't focus and feel motivated, they say you have dopamine issues, right? This is very, very common these days, thanks to people like Huberman, who have done amazing podcasts on the topic. And so you can see, if you don't have the starting material, you can't produce the end product. It's just not going to happen. And then people wonder why they feel bad or they can't function or they can't focus. And if we go upstream, we see that, well, you're not actually digesting the things you're consuming. If you're even consuming, a broad enough spectrum and enough food to meet your needs, right? Which is another question that needs to be answered. And so we can see we need the starting material if we're going to get to the end material. And these things are all connected. You know, we don't just jump from like, oh, I feel like shit to like, oh, let me just take a pill of dopamine. You can't really take direct pills. You can take dopa as a drug, and you can get that in things like mucuna is very high naturally in L-dopa. But then your body still has to convert it, still has to do that step. Another example, very quick here. This is melatonin, serotonin, and its starting material, tryptophan, right? So again, you got to eat something or take something that's got tryptophan if you're going to get to, this is 5-HTP, that's a supplement many people are familiar with. And then we get to serotonin, many people are familiar with this. And we get to an intermediate, which is not as popular, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name because it's not pertinent to the conversation. But from serotonin, there's an intermediate step. And then we get melatonin, another one that people are very familiar with, that allows us to get good sleep. Not to mention, it's one of the most potent anti-cancer compounds in the human body. And your pineal gland produces it. And so we need to be producing that if we want to be well. Is this making sense? This whole concept of we need raw material. Yes, good. We are made of it, and our body needs it to be able to do what it's designed to do. Key number 3, hormones and lab tests, and why normal on a lab test does not equal good or optimal or healthy. So I've got a couple of examples here, and we'll dive into why that's the case. So let's talk about testosterone. We'll use that as an example. It's a very hot topic. Many of us as men are interested in having more or having more optimized or balanced testosterone. Quick sip of water. And tell me if I'm speaking too fast. I can definitely get on a roll, but I'm hopefully still coherent. I don't see any confused faces, so I'm going to take that we're still at a good pace here. So testosterone. On a test, if you just go and ask for a testosterone test, you're likely to get a total testosterone test. The only test they'll likely do, total testosterone, which doesn't tell you how much testosterone your body actually has freely available to work with, right? Because free testosterone, which is a different test, is what's actually floating around in the system, right? Testosterone has to get to a receptor in order to exert its effects. And so if it's not free to attach to a receptor to then give the effect it gives, you're not going to have that. And you could have a normal or even slightly high total testosterone, but a low or insufficient free testosterone. So clinically, you feel tired, lethargic, slow, your libido's waning, etc. All those classic symptoms. But if they just do total testosterone and you're in the healthy, normal range, that's usually the end of discussion for a lot of doctors. It's like, okay, you're in the normal range, you're healthy, it must be something else, or it's all in your head, or whatever. So big difference there. We also have the ratio. You might have a high total testosterone, but you might also have high estrogens, estrogen metabolites, things that are, in a sense, opposite in their action to testosterone. And so the ratio matters too. There's this funny thing called SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin. This is like a thing that floats around in our blood and it grabs onto, as the name says, sex hormones or testosterone or progesterone. These things that are, or DHEA, these things that are the raw materials that are, not the raw materials, DHEA, sorry, is the raw materials for testosterone. But testosterone is like, it's the fuel, it's the juice that makes us feel like men. In a large extent, we need everything in balance, but to a large extent, it's there. And so if it's all bound up by SHBG, again, it's not free to be used. It's not going to be absorbed or it's not going to exert effects on the body. And so there's a big difference between how you might feel and what might be measured on a test, especially if it's a very narrow test that's not looking deeper than something like total testosterone. This is an example of someone. This was actually a client's lab test. You can see testosterone total. So he had total and free looked at. His result was quite low. And this made sense given where he was at. He was having erectile dysfunction. He was having low energy, low mood, just not really feeling like himself. But he was in the reference range, right? So if a doctor's not paying attention and they all they see is that this wasn't flagged as outside the range or abnormal, then they say, oh, you're in the reference range, you're probably fine, right? Okay, you might be at the low end, but it's not like a disease state. There's no disease here to be treated. And so a doctor who their only mandate is to treat disease is pretty useless at helping you here. Same thing with the free, although this was a little bit, higher into the range, but still not what we would consider ideal or optimal by any means, but still normal according to the standardized testing. Even the same thing here with vitamin D, right? He's barely above the bottom of the range. So certainly if this was higher, he'd probably feel a lot better. And it would it would probably make these numbers improve as well, because vitamin D, ideally from the sun, but also vitamin D supplementally, is one of the essential pieces of producing testosterone in the male body. Continuing on. This is actually something I'm very proud of. This was the first time I had my testosterone tested after years of tweaking and optimizing and feeling not so great, and then getting to a much better place. I was doing this test to rule out something else, but I wanted to see my numbers, and I was off the chart into the high range, right? So this was flagged as abnormal. This is like, not good in a certain context, but for me, I'm like, damn, I'm like riding high here. And I felt good. It made sense. I was doing a lot. I was taking good care of myself, and I had essentially put a lot of the previous symptoms I experienced into remission. And so to see, okay, I'm up here, and my assertion is that optimal and ideal for many of us is going to be toward the upper end or even above the upper end of the range. And a quick note on normal ranges for any marker here. The normal range changes. It even changes if you're in a different province. It's based on an average of the people who have done this test in the previous years. Now, most people who are going in to do testing with a doctor are by definition not feeling well. If you're feeling great, you're not really going in for a lot of testing. And so these ranges are developed as what's the minimum amount that someone needs to have to not be in a disease state, right? How much can they get by with, whether it's testosterone, whether it's iron, it's vitamin D, it's magnesium? What's the minimum amount required to prevent some sort of, catastrophic disease from really, really bad deficiency? That's the minimum. And then the normal range is somewhere in the middle there, but it does not in any way, shape, or form exemplify optimal or ideal when it comes to getting therapeutic benefit from a specific nutrient, right? If you want to get the benefits of, say, magnesium, and you're like piss poor depleted, you're likely going to have to take somewhere, depending on your body weight, depending on what's going on, you're going to have to take somewhere between 500 to 800 milligrams roughly over the course of a day total to get a therapeutic amount, right? And so if you go to the store and you take 150 milligrams, you take one capsule a day, and then you think, well, this magnesium didn't do anything for me. Well, it probably didn't, because you're not taking enough, right? You're not taking enough to get to that threshold dose and actually have a therapeutic effect. And yes, that was a blood test, just to be clear, Finn. Yeah, saliva is a good way to assess a lot of hormones. I do like saliva testing, and you can get saliva testing ordered. There's a couple of labs in Ontario, actually, that I've used to order for clients lab testing through saliva to look at things like cortisol and testosterone and all kinds of the hormonal symphony that we experience on a day-to-day basis. Moving on. This is a little bonus. This ties into testosterone. This ties into energy. This ties into digestive health. If anyone has the answer for what is one very commonly consumed beverage that you could argue, I would argue, causes more issues for men's gut health and hormonal imbalances than almost anything else. We've got coffee. Not thinking of coffee, although you can make a case for coffee. Beer, ding, ding, ding. Yes, beer, specifically beer. Alcohol has its own issues, specifically beer made with hops, which up until the 1500s, when the German beer purity law was put into place, beer didn't require hops, and it was actually made with all sorts of amazing medicinal herbs and tonic herbs. It was mandated for it to require hops, that more so for political reasons, as far as I understand. But hops, these guys, which are in basically all beer, unless you have some really cool craft beer. In the States, this is more common, non-hopped beer. But hops are incredibly high in plant estrogens, incredibly high. So much so that there was a condition called brewer's droop from back in the day when they would be touching these things with their bare hands and exposed to all those phytochemicals day in and day out, to where the brewer became impotent, right? Brewer's droop. Not the erect lingam that we're talking about with vitality, the opposite of that. Simply because of basically poisoning from overexposure to a plant-based estrogen. Now, the alcohol itself can have issues, of course. It can be stressful on the liver, and that needs to be looked at. But if one was to simply replace their occasional beer with like a dry cider, you'd be doing wonders for preventing beer belly, for preventing man boobs, for preventing just the worst aspects that we associate with people who drink a lot of beer. And they get this very round shape and develop feminine features in some ways. And it's not just because of the calories or the sugar, it's because of the plant estrogens that are driving the fat to be deposited in those areas. So that's just a little fun side note that I always love to share. And I learned all this through this fantastic book by Stephen Herod Buhner, the late great Stephen Buhner, awesome author, herbalist, just Renaissance man of many kinds, many sorts. And he also wrote this book, which I read parts of. I didn't actually make my own sacred healing beer, but I'd like to drink some sometime. So if anyone's got a niche or an itch to brew some non-hopped medicinal beer, count me in for a tasting. And this was very common back in the day, as you might imagine. People would be doing their stuff in their own home in small batches with all kinds of plants, maybe some psychedelic plants, maybe some different medicinal plants, but who knows? A lot of that was stripped out with the beer purity law, which was probably also tied to the church in some way, the puritanical aspects of that, to get the hops in there and to feminize the men who might otherwise be a little bit too wild with their wild beers, to govern and control. That's my theory, at least. So as we look at these pieces, and we're going to bring this ship in for a landing and then open it up to questions and attempt to tie this all together somewhat, and continue to do so in the discussion. But what happens when we address the root, right? As you can see, as I hope it's been made very clear, when we address the root, we can make symptoms go away. Gut health symptoms, bloating, gas, all these kinds of things that are very common, they can go away or improve. We can restore our energy and our mental clarity, and not just in some quick fix kind of way, but in a way that lasts, in a way that leaves us feeling like, oh, I didn't realize I could feel this good. That's one of the things I love hearing the most, when someone says, I never knew I could feel this good. I never knew this is how I was supposed to feel. And until we give ourselves the opportunity, we're living at a fraction of what's possible. Food sensitivities, chemical sensitivities, these can be reversed. You may not have heard that before, but it's very possible. Unless you have a full-on allergy, pretty much all sensitivities are reversible. Immune function improves. Hormones balance and begin to naturally optimize, right? Imagine that when you do the right things, when you avoid the toxic things, when you bring in the nourishing things, whether through food, through lifestyle, your system naturally begins to express at a higher, vibrational frequency, at a higher level of vitality, at a higher output. And that's a great point there, Finn. We can definitely talk about that in the questions. Yes, oftentimes periods of unpleasantness are required when we're coming from a toxic past. And the piece that I want to really drive home is that if we don't address things in a root cause fashion, it's typically a downward spiral, right? Life is dynamic. It's very rare that we stay stagnant. We're either spiraling up or we're spiraling down. However fast or slow that's occurring, we're not standing still. And so these kinds of conditions, they might start off as like a nagging symptom, but if we don't pay attention and if we don't listen to the symptoms as signals from your very wise and capable body alerting you that something needs addressing, then those things can spiral downwards And if we're not careful, a crisis will hit. And I don't want you to be like myself and wait for a crisis to nearly kill you before you recognize how important it is to take great care of your body temple. To make things real simple, and I had some fun with this, happy gut equals happy dog. No, I'm kidding. It's not happy dog. It's joy. It's a joyful life. Dogs to me exemplify in many ways unencumbered, in many ways non-conditional or unconditional love and joy and play. And so I want to throw that in there because I love dogs, and who doesn't like to see a beautiful pit bull smiling? But really, if you felt like this guy, like I have, like many of us have, and you prefer not to, and you prefer to ensure that your future doesn't turn into that, it is possible. It's possible for you. It's possible for me. It's possible for all of us who take the time to do the work and dig in and really find what works for us, right? Because what works for me might not be exactly what works for you, or what works for Rawa, or what works for Maddie, right? We're all going to have our own unique recipe that's contextual to our life and our age and stage, but either way, it's possible. Today, we talked mostly about nutrition. Stress reduction got in there a little bit, mindset got in there a little bit, but these are some of the pillars that I think about when it comes to that recipe, right? What is that recipe for feeling vital and living a revitalized life? That said, if you want to dive deeper, free nutrition audits available to anyone on this call. Also, if anyone here, and there's not that many of us here, but if you do, go ahead and book that. Remind me to give you my From Bloated to Boundless PDF and checklist guide, another little gift, my gift to you, to simplify a lot of more of the nitty gritty in terms of what one might do practically to move themselves from that state to a better state. That said, that's all I have. I would love to address questions, and I'm willing to stay on here past 8:30 for whoever wants to stay on. I will stop the share